Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the 37th Annual California Small Farm Conference. My name is Evan Wigg. I'm with Community Alliance of Family Farmers, and we are so excited to have you here because today, this is our very first workshop of 2025, and we've got a fantastic workshop to get us kick-started. So if you are here for a new model for farmland access and transition, the Farmland Commons, you are in the right place. We've got two wonderful speakers. We'll be talking about some cool strategies for getting access to land and really making community a part of that. So really appreciate you all for being here. Just want to encourage folks throughout the workshop to use the chat function to maybe introduce yourself, share resources, and use the Q&A function, which you'll see down below. To ask any questions. We'll have a lot of time at the end to ask questions and have a conversation with those attending. And with that, want to just give a huge shout out to all of our presenters, our sponsors, everyone who helped make this event possible. And with that, let's go ahead and get started. Thank you both for being with us today.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Evan, and thank you, everyone, for starting your day off to come together and learn about our work and have some discussion on what we do. So, my name is Ian McSweeney. I'm coming from southern New Hampshire to this conversation today. I'm co-founder, co-executive director of the Farmers Land Trust, and our work is on really transitioning, conserving farmland and farms into community ownership to address equity, tenure, and long-term stewardship at that point of generational transfer in so many ways.
And I am Kristina Villa. I am coming from Middle Tennessee. My partner and I steward 70 acres of land. We grow vegetables using organic biodynamic methods, and we sell to restaurants, grocery stores, other CSAs. We also have a herd of dairy cows, about 20 or so, and we do a raw milk herd share. So people come to our farm, pick up their milk each week. And we also are very serious about eating seasonally, eating year round, eating like a farmer. So we can freeze, ferment, dry, do all that jazz. And we don't own the land that we farm on, and we never have. Neither one of us came from landed families or from farming families, and we struggled as young farmers with land access. And so that is how I come to this work as a young farmer, and from that point of view of knowing that land access is such a difficult hurdle to overcome and wanting so badly to figure out ways to address that for young farmers, and also knowing and loving so many aging, retiring farmers and seeing them struggle without any support of how to transition their land in just equitable ways that also fulfills their legacy of farming.
So, and a little bit more about me. So I'm live in Southern New Hampshire from New England, from Massachusetts. I've lived a little bit around the country. All of my work for 2+ decades has been on that farm transition, farm conservation work. Initially in real estate, started a brokerage company to bring together developers, farmers, community stakeholders to focus on kind of a planned communities where everyone is at the table from the start to try to achieve conservation, agriculture, and neighborhood development goals. Moved from that into running a private foundation for a number of years. That private foundation started in New Hampshire, then grew around New England and a little bit around the country, all focused on providing grants and my time capacity to bring parties together at that point of farm transition. So from farmers, farm landowners, community stakeholders, land trusts, nonprofit food, agriculture organizations. So bringing them together. In doing that, kind of worked on a number of projects that were kind of innovating beyond what many land trusts were doing. I am fortunate here. You are also fortunate. We're all fortunate where we are, but you're fortunate where you are in California as well, that there's certain pockets around the country that really have such innovative and progressive conservation land trusts that are trying to do more, that are trying to address support farmers, that are trying to address the loss of farmland, consider affordability, farm practices. So that's what a lot of my work was informed by, was many New England states, land trusts, organizations addressing farm affordability, farming practices, looking at different ways to transition, conserve farmland. So learning from that, and then coming as a foundation able to incentivize people with my time and capital to do something additional, do something more. So did a number of kind of unique projects there that kept building on one and the next in many ways. One of those, a number of projects, but one of the communities was this Temple Wilton Farm, one of the first modern CSAs developed in the country that then, spread west, came to um, some closer to home for you in many ways, but Live Power Farm is probably the example many of you might be familiar with from longstanding CSA. But what we did there that I just want to call forward is that valuing and centering the work in community and framing the work around the farm ownership and farm transition piece, thinking that a CSA, community supported agriculture, can and needs to be more than just the annual business cycle of the farm. It really needs to be a much deeper, longer term relationship to the land and how that land is held to ensure the farm has secure, viable tenure on the land to operate and can transition to future generations because of that tenure on the land. So, that project and others helped really inform a lot of the work we're going to describe now, and I did since then. The one other piece kind of layering on my past to bring forward is I also started to bring forward a lot of crowdsourced fundraising, feeling that the reality of moving land ownership is not supported by many public funding sources. Again, you're in a very fortunate place with some funding, never enough funding, but some funding for that ownership transition of farmland, but never enough funding for that. So how to catalyze a bigger community, more capital to make the transition possible, knowing that the real estate is such an expensive cost. So started doing crowdsource fundraising to raise awareness and engagement in the project, but also to raise capital needed in a very flexible way. And so just kept building on those models, bringing forward this commons model years later, and then bringing us to where we are now that we'll talk more on.
So we've shared how we personally came to this work, and now just want to set the stage of the issues that are bringing us all to this work as a community, as a people, as a country, as farmers, landowners, organizations, which is that we are at the moment of multiple points of crisis. We have dwindling resources and social inequities that, if not addressed right now, will mean that we're not going to be able to have places to get our food in the future. 37 mid-sized farms close every single day, and every single day we're losing 2,000 acres from agriculture. Aging, retiring farmers don't have a way to pass their land on, and over and over and over again, land access is said to be the #1 barrier for young farmers. Meanwhile, farmland prices have appreciated by over 40% per decade, meaning that land is out of reach for all but wealthy people who are typically not farmers. And so, how can we address all of those things? And that is what we're doing, and that's what brings us here. And so we like to say this in any presentation that we give, which is that if you are a landowner and you're coming to this as a landowner, wondering how to transition your land or where to give your land, that finding Black or Indigenous people and giving your land directly to them as an act of reparations or as an act of rematriation is the preferred method and route. And we at all do not want to get in the way of that. We are a white-led national organization and a nonprofit. And so anytime that you're moving land into a nonprofit, that is not direct act of reparations and rematriation. We are working with groups around the country who are Black and Indigenous, and we can work with you and them to form something that is in line with reparative justice, but just want to say explicitly that giving your land to Black or Indigenous people as acts of reparation or rematriation is the most ideal way to go. Okay, so before we talk to you about our land trust and the unique and innovative work we're doing, we thought it'd be helpful to first get grounded in the work of typical land trusts.
So just as a background framing, so conservation land trusts established in Massachusetts in the mid 1800s came to be with trustees for reservations in the late 1800s, exist across the country in many different forms with different missions, values, priorities, and the way they work. Many conservation land trusts work with conservation easements as a primary tool and may hold title to land as a secondary activity or not at all. There's always exceptions to that. Many conservation land trusts are focused on natural resource protection and the prohibition against development extraction of land to ensure those natural resources are protected. There are always exceptions to that. There's a number of land trusts local to you in California that have really conservation land trusts that are centered on agriculture and farm viability and have focused their work to address kind of the active working farm. But I'm sure many of you, even in those cases, see the tension between the natural resource protection and the active farming engagement and kind of how that is played out in decisions around which gets priority over time. And that can be challenging. But conservation land trusts are a huge benefit to, countering the development, extraction, exploitation of land. They've done significant work local to you, local to all of us, and around the country. And they're a piece of the solution, we would argue, but they're one of the legs of a three-legged stool. By itself, it's not going to fully address farm viability or farm transition or everything else we discussed. But without them, it's a significant hurdle to address the market value of land, the pressures of land development. So yeah, that's just a touching on them, but just want to give you this framing.
And so, in addition to a conservation land trust, the other typical kind of land trust is a community land trust. And so the very first community land trust was created in the 1960s in South Georgia as an act of Black liberation. And their community land trust really focused on agriculture. They saw the need to own their homes, their businesses, and the land that they produced their food from in community to protect them against racism. And there were so many acts happening then of people being in protest against the civil issues happening, and then they were being kicked out of their homes. They weren't allowed in grocery stores. There was racist funding happening from the USDA. There's so much involved in this, and like we said, we're just briefly touching, and it's really hard to not just spend the whole day talking about this amazing model of a community land trust, which is where it all started from. But our work is deeply informed by New Communities Land Trust down in southern Georgia. And since then, the community land trust model has evolved past and beyond that. And now, instead of focus on agriculture, the community land trust model typically focuses on the built environment and housing affordability. And so the way that the community land trust model typically works is that the community land trust owns the land, and then individuals own the home that sits on top of the land. And so that's called a ground lease. So individuals own the home, then they can sell that to others in the future and as their way to build equity, while the land remains owned by the community land trust. And it really helps to put a cap and keep things affordable for future generations. And so we don't really fit in either one of those categories. We are a new kind of land trust. And what we've done is taken the very best parts of both of those types of land trusts to combine them into something new and innovative that really meets the moment of our time and the needs of our time. So our work is focused on commons, and again, to kind of lay the groundwork, land has been held in common since forever. This is not a new idea. It's really an ancient practice that we're trying to fit and putting into a modern context. We're holding land in common, but within the legal and social paradigms that we're living within today. And when we talk about land as commons, we are referring to the ownership of that land, not the use of that land. And so we'll get more into our model as we move on. I just wanted to set that stage of understanding of commons.
So the Farmland Commons model that we'll kind of dive into now is something we have developed. It uses existing nonprofit structures that we'll share details on. And what it does is takes those existing nonprofit structures that are defined by IRS and embeds in certain values. So this slide is just to articulate our high-level values that we hold in this work of the Farmland Commons. And these show up in the bylaws and the lease and the management plan and the agreements and structures that create these, both the nonprofit structures, the Farmland Commons, and the relationships agreements with the farmers on the ground. So overall, kind of in a more detailed way, those values that we hold and are embedded in this way are attempting to solve these or address these challenge areas. The item I touched upon, the tension between conservation land trusts and agricultural activities and viability is always going to be present. But how we, protect and preserve farmland and for who, land and people and enterprises, is important to think about. So we're, balancing that protection, preservation with the kind of context of both conservation and community land trust goals, and then those values I shared. All of this work for us happens at that point of transition, that for our work to happen, it takes that farmland owner, farmer at age of exit or planning for exit from ownership of the business, of the farm itself, and ready for, willing to plan, explore, and develop a plan for that transition out of business, out of farm ownership, with certain goals. So for us, all of our work is with regenerative, organic, biodynamic farms. And so many farmers at the point of transition that we work with have a goal of creating a legacy for what they've created in their lifetime or perhaps generationally on the ground, whether that legacy is building community or it's farming practices and building soil and ecosystem health. It's how to ensure that the next generation can carry that forward in an equitable, autonomous way, um, through their gift of lifetime of work and transition of farm into a model like this. So, we work at that point of transition. We work at that balance of protection and preservation, and all of this work requires, significant capital, fundraising, land donations, gifts of land, gifts of money in to support this transition. Because what we've seen for decades, for centuries, is extraction of capital from the land, from communities into kind of, separate enterprises, industry, business capital holders. And what we're trying to do is return that land ownership, capital, equity back to community. And so, as you would imagine, in our society, farmland has a certain market value. Many have an expectation around what they will get financially in return once they let go of that ownership piece. So that requires significant capital. All of our work is connecting to people's value systems. So it's that legacy piece. So it's not intended to buy land on the market and pay market-based prices, but it is needing to navigate through that process to find those landowners who have a heart connection to the land they're on, to what they've built for their lifetime, and that they want to see that continue into the future. So they're willing to be creative and flexible with what that transition looks like.
Now for the exciting stuff.
So I touched upon kind of the legal structures. So now just to dive into those a little bit and to name that, you know, we are going through and sharing a lot with you. We really want to answer all the questions you have at the end. There's also a lot more information that we won't touch on that we're happy to have follow-up conversation. We're happy to share more information. There's a lot on our website to explore and learn from. But this starts to get really into the details, the weeds of things in some ways. So we use, in this Farmland Commons structure, we use these existing IRS defined entities, either a 501c25 or a 501c2 entity. They are limited scope landholding affiliate entities. So they, according to IRS, their scope is simply that they can acquire real estate and property. They can hold that real estate and property. They can manage and steward that real estate and property, and they can lease that out to others. So in a 501c25 structure that this slide depicts, a main characteristic beyond what I've just described to you is that it requires the collaboration of multiple nonprofit entities, from 3 on a minimum to 35 at a maximum, according to IRS, have to come together in collaboration to form this 501c25. So the 501c25 requires 3 or more nonprofits to come together, form the bylaws, incorporate the entity, and share the governance responsibility of that. And then it's simply that narrowly focused landholding affiliate structure. And the 501c2, similar to what I described, the main difference being it's solely connected to one 501c3 entity. So that's the primary difference. There are, other details in the IRS language, and that links to that. Those definitions are up on our website. We're also happy to share more. You could simply also just Google 501c2 and C25 and get a lot more robust information from IRS. But the 501c2 is just that single entity, 501c3 connected, but it's the same scope as far as holding title to real estate and property, stewarding, managing real estate and property, and leasing that out.
And so in either case of a farmland commons, either the 501c25 or the 501c2, the Farmers Land Trust could be one of the parent 501c3 nonprofits coming together to form this, but we also don't have to be. So there are groups that we're working with around the country who we are just supporting and guiding and offering the technical assistance needed for them to create a farmland commons of their own, without us being part of the legal and power structures of that. I also want to note that a reason to use the 501c25 or the 501c2 from a farmer's perspective is that because it is that limited scope landholding entity, the Farmland Commons is not allowed to interfere with the day-to-day operation or the business or the life on the ground of the farmer and that land. And so it gives them the most autonomy and independence possible out of any of the legal structures to have access to land and then still be able to have the support of other nonprofits, of other people, of community in this way, without having to give up any of their independence and autonomy, which is very different from a farmer just leasing land from a nonprofit. And then another reason to own land in this way instead of just a 501c3 is that liability shield it allows for. And because it is this limited scope landholding entity, the Farmland Commons 501c25 and 501c2 does not have that same overhead need of a typical nonprofit. And therefore, it allows a 501c3 to be involved in something meaningful and impactful around land access and land protection and farmland business viability without having to give up too much of their capacity and support for it. And so this 501c25 or 501c2 then becomes its own standalone entity. So it has its own board of people. And in the Farmland Commons model, whoever that leaseholder is, whoever is going to be getting the 99-year lease and be the farmer steward on the ground, is also represented on the board. That way, that farmer is not just a leaseholder, but they're also part of the ownership and they're also part of the power structure. That board is representatives from the parent 501c3s and also community members. So we advocate for the board being local people who are local to place, who are close to that farmland, who are part of the interconnectedness of that community, who support that farm, who get food from that farm. And the roles of that board are simply to hold title to land and to convey lease out to steward, farmer, rancher. And then they have their own budget, and any money that is brought in from the lease then goes back into the land, not up to those parent 501c3s. So the management and stewardship happens in that local farmland commons. People always ask about how the land gets into the farmland commons. And so we eventually ended up creating this illustration that is very helpful. So as Ian shared, we only are able to do this work with willing and aligned landowners who see the need and the value of this and who are willing and able to either fully donate the land or work with us to get a discounted bargain sale that then they're able to wait the time needed to do the fundraising and funding and capital finding of all that would need to come together to acquire the land, and then also fund longer term endowment and reserves for the carrying costs of the land. So the land starts with a private landowner, and then it moves into one of the parent 501c3s. And then from there, it's moved right into the local 501c25 or 501c2 farmland commons. So it's held in the Farmland Commons. That's where the deed is held. And then farmer, steward, rancher gets 99-year lease, or as long as state law will allow. And it's really important to note also that this structure does not exempt you from local zoning or permitting or any other deed restrictions or encumbrances or conservation easements or anything else that's still on the land. All of those still apply. So then the steward gets a 99-year lease. And this is important because I'm saying the word lease, but it's not operating like a typical lease. So this is for 99 years. This means it's multi-generational. This is something that the steward of the land can then pass on to their children or next generation identified farmer. They're also part of the board that creates these lease terms. So they are not just receiving the lease, they are part of the process in creating the terms. So they are saying and stipulating what will work for them also. And while we do not do conservation easements as the Farmers Land Trust, we do sometimes work with land trusts that do conservation easements. And also we do put strong conservation language within the lease. And so within the lease is where the stewardship stipulations around regenerative agriculture, land protection, the land being free from many things and including rights of nature and so forth, that is all in the lease and spoken to through the lease. This lease can also operate as a ground lease, similar to how we discussed with the community land trust. So it is possible that the Farmland Commons could own the land while the farmer themselves own the house or other buildings or infrastructure on top of the land.
So in this, just to expand on the lease a little bit more, is that this lease, the order of documents as far as kind of priority and when they're recorded with the deed or not recorded with the deed is something we've spent a lot of time thinking on and planning, and is embedded in the structure to try to give as much security to the farmer and to ensure that the farmland is actively used going into the future. So, one of the steps in where that shows up is the leases are something that a notice of lease or the lease itself is recorded with the deed where possible in state law as an encumbrance on the title itself, so that lease would survive any transfer of land. So, the worst case scenarios of the nonprofits going away or kind of moving in a different direction or selling the land for some reason. The intention is to protect against all those worst case scenarios in a number of ways, but just to name here that one of those ways is that the lease, being a encumbrance on the title itself, gives standing in that point of transition for the leaseholder. The flexibility around the lease to be different from one farm property to the next in how it considers building ownership, infrastructure ownership, its consideration of whether there's a single leaseholder and subleaseholders, or there's multiple leaseholders. All that looks different from one farm and one farmland commons to the next in our work. What we've done is create this national model and resources around that space, and then everything has to be localized to state, and then further localized to the farmland commons, so that food shed community it's working in, and then finally localized to the farm itself, to the farmers, to the land, to the farm itself. So that shows up in the leases of each one looking different, but all having some shared values embedded in them.
And so just to touch on a few points also of how this model is distinctly different than just the nonprofit itself of a 501c3 holding land, which is that the leaseholder then is part of that power structure instead of a national organization owning land which is so similar to these absentee landowners that all over the country are gobbling up land, but then are not connected to or part of the community that has that land. So this gives the power and ownership to the local community who actually lives with and are connected to that land, while also being supported by national, regional, other nonprofits. That 501c25 is so unique and wonderful in the way that it brings together multiple nonprofits, building out resilience and long-term support. And so as that model works, it's at least 3 nonprofits, but could be up to 35. And so there's a lot of flexibility also where other nonprofits can be added to be part of the organization and structure. And also nonprofits can go away over time. And so, in some cases, we've been asked to be one of the nonprofits that come together to form a C25, knowing that in 5 years, we'll step back to make room for other nonprofits that are comfortable with and ready to move forward in that way. Also, in that worst case scenario extremes that we're always thinking about and needing to plan for, is that if a nonprofit were to dissolve and go away, there are these other nonprofits there to support it. Or if a nonprofit goes rogue and changes mission or value, those other nonprofits are there to hold them in check. And so there are many reasons and ways that this model is layering in multiple legal agreements and many different safety nets to protect the land and the farmer as far into the future as we can, while also being flexible to know that people change, land changes, agriculture changes, and that we need to be able to make these legal structures, legal agreements, be able to adapt to that as needed as we move forward.
So this gets at another piece of that kind of our values that embedded in the structure itself, and how we have created this unique model from existing commonplace nonprofit structure. And this calls for that farmer role. The farmer is getting a long-term, secure, equitable, and affordable lease. That's what we've been talking about in many ways. Um, but the farmer is also in this model holding a seat on this Farmland Commons board. So leaseholders being a percentage of each of the Farmland Commons boards, and those leaseholding farmers having a seat, voice at the table is critically important in our mind to kind of hold that balance of the knowledge, the wisdom, and the connection to land, having a voice and a decision-making authority throughout the structure, and at the same time, a nonprofit of other organizations, stakeholders sharing in that and holding a majority in that control over this land for the shared values that everyone comes together around, and the stewardship and farm practices that are held up as important and what bring people together to form one of these farmland common structures. So that balance and the importance of farmers' voice, farmers' seat at the table is critical to this. And so that's embedded in the model in different ways. We also see that kind of outside of the direct structure of this model, but belief that this model helps to get at these points, are that farming can be a very lonely and isolating business. Farming can be very individualized in ways that may be beneficial and desired by many, but are also a challenge to compete with larger agribusiness, or a challenge to compete with the smaller volunteer gardeners, say, and the price points at a farmer's market. So that finding ways to build collective relationship, support, power amongst that mid-size food production regenerative farmers is so critical, we feel. And there's pressures on them from both sides of the large and the small in the agricultural sectors. So how to kind of provide structure, this Farmland Commons, that allows farmers to connect with one another, build relationship, to learn from one another, to be part of a board that's sole purpose is on holding that farm and supporting that farmer, brings them into relationship with others who value that farm for the same way they do. And it also brings them into connection with other farmland commons being developed and in operation around the country. So it's building connection in ways that we feel are beneficial for farmers. And it's also building supports and examples and learning around ways for the mid-sized farm businesses that are under such extreme pressure to learn from one another, to collaborate, to work collectively around, everything that may be a stressor or a pressure point for them. So this slide kind of helps to define some ways that this model works with other structures. And so I will spend a little bit of time here. This also, there's a few questions people have put in the chat that really relate to this side of things. So I'll try to both share the slide and answer some of those questions. We're also happy to get into more depth on any of those questions. But so, this model is meant to be one of the other legs of a three-legged stool. Like it in and of itself is not the solution to what's needed. As we argued, neither is conservation land trust in and of itself. It's, how to partner with these different land trust organizations, how to partner with different food, agriculture, community organizations to build a structure that addresses the protection of land so it is not lost, the ownership, equity, and tenure in land so it is in the right hands and is able to be part of the viability structure for farms, and the farm business support and transition. Like there's a lot of needs to support farms and stop the loss of farms. And this is intended to be, one piece of the puzzle. And what we were seeing was really unattended to kind of critical areas of need. The fact that farmers voice their lack of access to farmland, lack of capital to get on farmland as primary barriers. Like we as a culture, we as a public, we as nonprofits set up for the public good should focus on that ownership, equity, and tenure piece of farmland. And that's what we're trying to do here. So, we work with conservation land trusts in really three different ways, like in a number of ways that conservation land trust may have already protected the farm with a conservation easement years ago, and that conservation easement runs in perpetuity, so that the ownership transition into this model is no different than any other ownership transition that might take place in the farm where the conservation easement is remaining encumbering the land, and the conservation land trust is there to enforce those terms. So, in that case, we might take a farm ownership into a farmland commons, and the conservation easement exists, and it always will. And what we have seen and what we kind of advocate for is that conservation land trust then becomes a collaborating partner. Maybe they're one of those nonprofits that helps form the farmland commons. Maybe they're not, but they're a collaborator in other ways, but they're, a beneficial party in the mix. Other times it's a conservation easement that is, we have developed that relationship and move forward that conservation easement transaction to align with the ownership, the title transition, because that might bring in some of the funding needed to acquire the land, or most or all of the funding needed for landowner to exit. It might bring in, or it does bring in, that additional partner land trust who can help focus on the conservation side of things. So that kind of at time of transition of the land into a farmland commons is the second area that we see conservation land trust show up in our work. And the third is kind of an after the land has come into a farmland commons, working on a conservation easement in the future could be beneficial for those same reasons mentioned, that it could bring a partner to the table who's going to be focused on the conservation of land and it could bring money to the table that could help with infrastructure investment or farm improvements in different ways. So there's different ways that that could be of benefit. Overall, conservation land trusts, uh, one area that shows up a lot is what I touched on before, that tension between natural resource protection and ag viability. So that always exists on older easements that are already on the farm. Like, that's going to be potentially more problematic if those easements have been overly restrictive to all the land, say. In other cases, the older easements, say, were early stage of conservation easements and have limited language around the protection, so they're more open-ended in different ways. So it really all depends. When we're engaging in the conservation easement negotiation process ourselves, we really try to ensure that long-term perspective, to ensure there's enough excluded land out of the easement for future building, commercial enterprise expansion for the farm, that it doesn't conflict with the conservation easement, because the conservation easement can be a primary obstacle in limiting certain types of expansion or kind of adapting that a farmer might do in their practices or infrastructure needs or how their sales take place. And its conservation easement always exists. So how to navigate that is something to be very considerate of upfront in writing that, because the other aspect that we see as an obstacle in many ways, that was a question brought up, is that zoning, permitting, approval side of things. That again, that is something that exists. The farm, that land, the property itself is defined as having certain zoning rights and approvals. It can go through, the zoning process to get a special exception or a use change. That can be, complicated, expensive, and a long-term proposition in many cases. And a lot of times it can be rejected. So it's fully understanding what that zoning is up front, because that is what likely will stay with the land and be restricting in some ways what's possible on the land. So, this model does not change the conservation easement restrictions, and it does not change the zoning requirements on the land in any way. The only thing it does do different from the status quo you might be considering is that a farmer individually owning the farm in the future, like, everything falls on their shoulders to navigate. So farmer who's running a farm business, having to navigate the terms of a conservation easement and what it takes to build the new barn they need and the approval process for that, or looking at the zoning and seeing what is allowed and what's possible for a change or a special exception, falls all on their shoulders. In this model, it's trying to bring together a collaboration of people and organizations to support those farms, right? So the farmer is not alone in their work, that a farmer is supported in many ways, and these are some ways that a farmer is supported. Like, then the nonprofit Farmland Commons board is there to help navigate that conservation land trust, the zoning, permitting, approval side of things. So for us, many of these Farmland Commons boards, we advocate for or help to cultivate bringing on people as board members who have knowledge in that space. Every Farmland Commons has an attorney connected to it. But whether it's an attorney or other land trusts or other kind of land use professional, that's a critical need for so many farms. And having this nonprofit can help support that in different ways. The other things on this slide mentioned, like, around other business collaborations with farm, food, community, like, they could be part of the board as nonprofits. If they're 501(c)(3)s, they could be one of those organizations to form the Farmland Commons. They could be a collaborator defined in many different ways. They could have a seat on the board. Those nonprofits that form the board are then appointing who the seats are held by. So it could be by the nonprofit, staff, or board. It could be by others they appoint. So, a nonprofit that forms a Farmland Commons could appoint to their board seats people who are in that community, in different farm food community-based enterprises that should be part of and want to be part of this. So that, you know, they can be involved in those ways. Another aspect to bring forward here is that this model is meant to be a way to address the ownership, access, and tenure to land, with the understanding that land, the market value, who owns land, who has access to land, is a huge barrier for so many farmers. And it's a huge barrier to consider the cost of market-based farmland. So using a nonprofit to raise capital, to accept donations, and to decommodify the land is critically important in our eyes to address that cost of farmland, lack of access to farmland, how we treat farmland, how we transact and commodify farmland, to move it out of all that into a community connection. And that is why we use a nonprofit structure, but it's narrowly focused on this ownership of land, lease conveyance of land piece. We don't have an opinion on what the leaseholder farm business should be. Like, there's appropriate needs for nonprofits, for-profits, cooperatives, everything to exist. And so the leaseholder can be whatever legal structure makes sense for them and is viable for their farm business, or multiple legal entities could be, you know, the farm business itself, lease structure. It up to the farm, up to the local community, what's viable. This is simply leasing to whatever that legal enterprise is and makes sense. But the nonprofit is in that land holding piece. The Yeah, the kind of the last piece is just
Sorry.
that, you know, this work in general is long, and it takes a lot of steps involved in the work. So land coming in, you know, it for us, this work is centered on the land itself, on people, farmers, community stakeholders, and on organizations to bring together that Farmland Commons structure. So it takes all of those stakeholders coming together, building relationship up front, to then step forward to begin to develop the agreements, incorporate the Farmland Commons entity, and then to transition the real estate, the farm real estate, into the structure and convey a lease out. Some of this can happen in parallel, but it's, you know, it's a long and winding path, and this is what this slide is meant to articulate, that it should take time, it needs to take time, and it needs to consider these, you know, relational shared agreements, the transfer and transactions as well. Like, each of those are important and should not be left out of the total process itself.
And so everything that we've talked about today, all of the model, all of the legal structure, all the legal templates, everything about it is all open resource. It's all available to you through our website. And like, what do I mean by that is, so yeah, what do I mean by that? What I mean is you all could go to our website, download the legal templates, and never talk to us again and form a Farmland Commons all on your own. And I just think that's so incredible. And really, the whole point of this was that we think that land should be held in common, but also knowledge and resources should be too. And so we don't want to gatekeep that. We want that to be open and available for everyone, because when you're trying to build a movement, when you're trying to change the way that land is held and how people can be in relationship with land and decommodifying land, then you need to make it open for everyone to use. You can't hold on tightly to it and say, this is mine. And so really, we wanted to make something that was so accessible so that anyone anywhere could use it, so that we can really start to change the game in this country of how land is owned, accessed, and how tenure is gained, and the type of farming that we practice, and the type of people who have access to land. And so you could use every bit of it and form a Farmland Commons on your own, or you could just use the pieces that are helpful. So we talk to farmers sometimes who said, that lease was so great. We just downloaded the lease and we changed it to fit our needs. And now that's the lease we're operating with the landowner we work with. And that's fabulous. Yes, do that if you'd like to. I think something to note about our legal templates is that they obviously were made with lots of teams of attorneys, but also they were made with the input and feedback from young farmers, aging, retiring farmers, nonprofits, just different types of people in geographic diversity, but also life points diversity, also business diversity. And so the reflections that are embedded in these documents are really valuable to all aspects of where we're all coming from. So please feel free, go take them. And I'll say to that too that, some projects, some farmland commons around the country, like we are just supporting in that helping to develop, and some, very different. We're part of the structure, but I can't wait to hear about how people take these and do it on their own. And I'll maybe get a Google alert someday being like, this farmland commons was formed and we didn't have to do anything to make it happen. So please go help yourself. Also wanted to share the farmland commons that are in development around the country. It's very exciting, and we will be sharing out publicly later this year a whole next cohort of farmland commons projects. And yeah, they're in every stage of development. And I saw a question in the chat too about how long is land held in the 501c3 before it's transitioned into the C25 commons. And this map is bringing that up for me because I'm thinking about how in some of these projects, the land is being transferred into a 501c3 first as a donation to then go out and form a farmland commons. Whereas in some of them, the farmland commons is being formed with the intention of the same day that all of the papers are signed, the land will move into the C3 and then right into the farmland commons. And so it can vary depending on the project and the people involved and how far along each stage is and what the needs are of the landowner, of the farmer, and what the capabilities are of the organizations that are involved. But yes, very exciting work happening around the country. And if you notice, there's not any in California yet. So maybe after this call, we can fix that. So yeah, definitely want to dive into question and answer, but first want to thank you all so much for your interest in coming to our presentation and sharing your time on a Sunday with us. Would be so grateful if you went to our website and signed up for our newsletter and follow us on your favorite social media. So go like our page on Facebook, connect with us on Instagram. We're also on Blue Sky now. LinkedIn is a great place to stay in touch. We're also on TikTok, which is just fun. So, and then, yeah, if you're inspired by what we're doing, send us a donation. We would be so thrilled. We'll see your name come in and we'll do a little dance and we'll think, wow, they really resonated with them and we'll so appreciate it. So yeah, questions, conversations, comments?
Yeah, so thank you for all this. We see a bunch of questions in the chat, so happy to dive into those. But grateful to have this time together to share, and from all the comments, it seems like it really resonated. So I really appreciate that.
Great. Thank you both so much. So for those of you at home, if you would like to, if your question has not been answered in the chat or in today's presentation that you put in the chat, go ahead and put that in the Q&A feature, which you'll find down here below, and we will get to those questions. So the first one I want to bring up is from Mary Chambers. She asks, who is responsible for property taxes in this scenario?
Yeah, so as a kind of broad picture answer to that, and it may be the broad answer to other questions to come, is so much of it depends. It depends on the individual farmland commons, and it's all detailed in the agreements, those lease agreements between parties. So, much of this depends, and it's going to look different from one to the next. But overall, the leaseholder is responsible for property taxes and insurance, and the lease itself is describing that responsibility. And to add to that for a piece, like, and this gets at some related to other question asked, was that, generally the property taxes are the same as if the farm was owned by any other party. State to state, there are ability for nonprofits to seek exemption from property taxes, but it looks different what type of nonprofits or what the land base is being used for by the nonprofit, whether they qualify for an exemption or not. So it looks quite different what's possible in any type of exemption. Our kind of advocacy is that this is a community-based model, valuing and needing community. So the payment of property taxes to support the community are critically important.
Great. And another question we have here from Marisa is, have you worked with a land seller who needed the income from their land and brought in public, philanthropic, or crowd-funded money to support the sale?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. That is such an important part of our work. So as I shared from the beginning, I come to this, and I think Ian and I both feel so strongly that we connect with and see and are, love and value so many aging, retiring farmers who are struggling. Like, their only option that they know of right now is to either sell their land on the open market or pass it on to their heirs who may or may not want to continue on the legacy of farming. Or, of course, put a conservation easement on it and then sell it or pass it on to their heirs. But they need other options. And part of our work is to make sure that equitable transitions happen. And very often that means that aging, retiring farmer who is counting on the land for their retirement gets a payout of that. What we don't do is base that on market price or market the ideas of what should or could be gotten from a real estate transaction. What we do is work with those aging, retiring farmers to find out, what do they need? What do they actually need from the exit of their land? Because some of them, when it comes down to it, they only want half of what the market says it's worth. And for that, yeah, we are happy to support that. In some cases, they also want to live out their days on the land. And so there are other aspects to our work, not just the payout, but how can we help support this farmer in getting what they need and want out of the land? And so, many land trusts, if they take in land from an aging, retiring farmer, they then want that farmer to go. But very often we're working with them so that they get to live out their days, and or so that they can make sure that their next generation still has access to the land if they want to farm it. And so there's all of these different tools and agreements that we can do or make that help ensure all of the goals and needs are met, including that financial piece, which I heard a few things in that question. So I'll just say that typically our work is through philanthropic donations. That's individual donors, private foundations, organizations, businesses that want to support this. And there's not really been public funding available for land acquisition work. Public funding is available for conservation easements, but not land acquisition. And so no, not public dollars, but yes, philanthropic donations. And we also stay away from investment capital when we're trying to acquire land, because we don't want the land or that future farmer to be saddled with debt that they then have to service off of farming income. And so really it's all through philanthropic donations.
Well, it certainly sounds like the number and diversity of arrangements can be as unique as the farmers themselves, because there's really going to be a lot of unique circumstances. And I think this is a really extra important question here in California, where land values are well above and beyond just about, what someone needs to retire or survive. So I think that's really important.
I'll just add too,
Yeah.
okay. Is that, when we're a small nonprofit, and we have to be very selective of who we work with and what projects we decide to take on, because obviously we only want to play games where we know we can win. And so when we're working with community, part of it is, what is the ecosystem that already exists? Like, what is the community that farmer has already built around them, and how willing and able are they to collaborate with us to do a fundraiser if we're going to commit to a fundraiser? Like, we are not a bank. We don't just have money lying around. Like, we have to actively go out and do that. And so it is about, like, what story are you telling that then inspires people to want to give and support that. And so it has to be a rich impact for the community, an impact for the environment, an impact for the future of food, for the land, it has to be really worth it if we're going to engage in a fundraiser. Obviously, when there's a landowner that approaches us with a land donation, then that's a different story. Then we're not fundraising to acquire the land, in which case, yeah, so.
Another question we have here in the Q&A is from Wendy. She asks, how is this model the same or different from Agrarian Commons, which is a similar organization?
Yeah, totally. So we worked at Agrarian Trust and developed the Agrarian Commons model and launched that out, and they had a lot of learning from that, and then wanted to really focus solely on this commons-based work in all the ways we've described to you today. So left to start the Farmers Land Trust to narrowly focus on commons-based work, both as a land trust doing the work, but also equally or more so as a resource, support, guidance for others to create it on their own. So yeah, that agrarian commons model was the next stage of, like I touched on in my intro, the kind of learning and creating projects with early CSA farm and then layering on crowdsource fundraising that when I was running the foundation, did a number of one-off projects that kind of built on different aspects of where we are now. Then as the foundation sunsetted its operations and we were closing down, I came on as first full-time staff of Agrarian Trust and developed this Agrarian Commons model with others in collaboration. Sustainable Economies Law Center was mentioned in the chat. Like, they were instrumental in research into what other kind of multi-entity legal structures land trusts were using around the country and the bylaws used and and such. So we did a lot of research with them and others as partners. Then that Agrarian Commons was like the first launch of a broader national, as opposed to one-off single projects in my kind of work trajectory, was this, how do we operate in a multi-state endeavor, raise a lot of awareness and interest in this, and try to create a ripple to the work that engages more people to question the way things are going and to learn about new ways to hold land. And yeah, so inspired that it took off from May 1st of 2020 to today, and really the interest we see and the different people talking about commons work is just so amazing and so inspiring. And so yeah, different organizations, they're carrying on work. They'd got a federal USDA grant to carry on agrarian commons in a number of locations, and we're kind of working around the country on our work.
Very cool. So another question we have here from Dennis, I think it's a specific one, but I think it touches to maybe something bigger, which is, and if the leaseholders don't pay their taxes. And I think, that could be broadened to say, like, what about liability when you have so many different players in the mix, and where does liability end up falling?
Yeah, so I guess two kind of primary components I'd share on this. Like, one, like, it's a lease arrangement, so there are things that would lead to a violation of lease, and then there's language in the lease as to how violations are remedied. So first through discussion, later through courses of action. But if a leaseholder stops paying the taxes, that could lead eventually to termination of lease. So that's one side of it, and the language is going to detail what that looks like, and some of it's going to look different from one lease to the next, but it's a staggered approach to try to remedy the situation. But ultimately, that could lead to a violation, termination of lease. On the other side of the equation, for the Farmland Commons organization and their responsibility, liability, all the work that we do, we advocate for and roll into initial fundraising several years of reserves for taxes, insurance. And then if they're spent down, needing to replenish those through lease revenue or fundraising in. But so, understanding the context that whether it's a leaseholder that stops paying the property taxes, or another scenario is the leaseholder exits, and they may give years and years of notice and intention to exit, but then the time of transition to get new farmer on board, there might be some time where there's no leaseholder in place. So making sure there's enough reserves for those type of scenarios is critically important for any, land holding structure. But the limitations, because of the limited scope of this C2, C25, it's really just the liabilities around property taxes, insurance, and that general upkeep. And the lease spells it out. But if the lease does not, if the leaseholder and the lease is not upheld, then that's where the responsibility liability comes to the commons, just on those aspects of things.
Great. Another question we have here from Denise is, would this work with real estate funds?
It could potentially. So, there's a couple states around the country that have real estate or environmental funds or other kind of low to no cost capital that has a long-term horizon that could be parked somewhere. So could be very beneficial for real estate funds that could be used to acquire property and then hold it without adding any interest rate return, and not having a short-term exit needed. The flip side, though, is its investment capital. So at the end of the day, what's the exit for that fund, and what is the capital needed to allow that fund to exit? And, even if it's 50, 99 years out, what is that, where does that capital come from? What's the strategy to allow the fund to exit? And I guess the one other piece I bring forward there is just that, that the market value of farmland is so extremely high. It continues to appreciate, and we're nowhere near the top of what that might look like, but it's so high and so out of reach for farmers that anything that doesn't use some level of philanthropic capital is simply just carrying forward that existing market value of the farmland. So even if there's no additional cost tacked on by specific public or private funds that might be very aligned in some ways, you're locking in that present value, and then you're needing to have capital to allow that value to be realized and that fund to exit at some point. So using, there's for the right thing, and to think about scaling this in some ways, that those type of funds would be critically important. But what the percent of investment funds that could be used within that structure, and what amount is needed from philanthropic to reduce that value of farmland to something that's more reasonable for agriculture, is critically important.
And it looks like we have enough time for maybe one or two more questions. So I'll give you one quick one and maybe one longer one. The first one, quick, is, are donations to a 501c25 tax deductible?
So yeah, I see so many good, great conversational questions in the chat and everywhere. And we are so happy to follow up with conversation or just answer questions via email. So if you send an email to info@thefarmerslandtrust.org, or, follow up, send us an email. We'd be happy to schedule a time to meet, or just talk via email, or whatever works for you. But so to get a tax deduction, you'd have to donate to the parent 501c3 and have it earmarked for the C25. So just as the land flows, it would flow through the C3, then down to the commons itself.
Gotcha. And then the last one, which, we obviously can't get into as much in depth given our time, but I think it's an important one, especially those who are maybe new to this concept. But the question has to do with improvements, buildings. There's whether a farmer builds a barn, improves the soil, builds a fence, installs a well. How does that work within the lease?
Yeah, so it comes down to where the funding comes from. So the commons would own the land, and then if the farmer leaseholder uses their own capital to build a building or make improvement, then they own that, and that is something that they could sell when they exit.
And are those are those decisions made in concert with the organization? So for instance, if a farmer wants to put in a massive milking barn or something like that, that's going to be, you can't move it, right? Is that something that happens in a negotiated process between the leaseholder and the organizations who own the property?
Yeah, completely. And the template formation documents that we have online, one of those is the management plan, and that speaks to kind of reporting decision making around the improvements, infrastructure investments, things like that. Because, right, like the farmer can build what they want on the land, but it may become a future liability that nobody wants to buy, or they're never going to get their money out. So how to like collectively have that discussion and do a little more broad-based research into, is it viable? Will this generate return in farm business production side of things and or in resale in the future? To have everyone be on the same page and aware is critically important. But that's built into the, annual discussions, management plan, reporting side of things.
Great. Well, we have reached time, but I just want to thank both of you for this wonderful workshop. Obviously, we could spend hours and hours talking
No,
about
yeah.
this. And so
Yeah.
I did put your email address in the chat if folks want to follow up with additional questions. I encourage you, I also dropped their website in the chat earlier, so I encourage you to check that out. There's lots more information online, but thank you both so much for being a part of this year's conference, for kicking us off here on Sunday
Yeah.
morning.
Thank
And
you.
we hope to be in touch. And as to all of our attendees, I would just encourage you to check out the rest of the program. We hope to see you at the next workshop. And with that, have a wonderful day, everybody.
Bye. Thank you.